On this version of Pit Stop, I have a very special guest, and I'm honored to call him my friend. Mr. Tom Davis joins me, and Tom, welcome, buddy.
Jimmy, I'm proud to be here with you.
Well, look, Tom knows more than anybody I know about the history of the Orioles. But before we start with the Orioles, Tom, I want to know a little bit about Tom Davis. When you were little, at what point did you say, I want to be a broadcaster?
Well, I wasn't any good at Little League Baseball. That's when I decided if I'm going to be involved in sports, it better be talking about it than playing it. And I can remember back into the 50s when I would hear Chuck Thompson do the Orioles games and Ernie Harwell, and they sort of motivated me. And, of course, Vince Bagley doing the television sports at Channel 11. And then, of course, when you look back at some of the other things that were involved, I mean, there were a lot of people that helped me out along the way, and a lot of friendships developed, and a lot of people were very kind to me and gave me a chance, including the late Bob Brown, who just passed away, who was the Orioles PR director. And he used to let me come into the Memorial Stadium press box and practice play-by-play. I mean, I just can't thank enough people that have helped me out along the way.
Well, I'll tell you, you mentioned Chuck Thompson. You know, we've been blessed with great teams, and we got one of the best broadcasters of all time, Hall of Famer. And tell me a little bit about Chuck.
Well, the big thing with Chuck was that he had a tremendous voice, and he connected all the decades for sports fans, no matter how old you are, into the 90s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. He was there for all the Orioles' great moments, and he was there for all the great Colts moments, and he was the last man to call a Colts game in Baltimore along with Vince Bagley before the Colts moved to Indianapolis. The one thing I learned from Chuck was that there are certain things how to describe games, especially on the radio. It was always a ground ball to shortstop. It wasn't a ground ball to Belanger. In football, it was always to set up the play. It was always 3rd down and 13 from the Baltimore 35. That meant there was still 65 more yards to go to possibly score a touchdown. He'd go Roger Carr wide left, Glenn Doughty wide right. The back split behind Burt Jones. Jones on a takeaway goes back to pass, sets, fires. He's got Glenn Doughty on the right side for a first down at midfield. And he's tackled out of bounds. That told me a very visual picture. That's what Chuck always did, was create a visual picture of the game of football. And I can't say enough about how great Chuck Thompson was, and we certainly do miss him here in Baltimore.
Well, I'll tell you what, I want to add to that. I'm fortunate enough got to work with Tom for over 30 years now. I run camera for him while he's on camera. And it's weird that I'm actually interviewing him, but I'm honored to do this. But I tell you, the first time I met Chuck, recording with Tom, it brought back, I was a little kid in the 60s. It tossed me back to where my dad would put the radio out the living room window to the front porch, and we would listen to the ball game. And you know, back then all the games were on television, and it was amazing. I heard Chuck's voice, and I was a 9-year-old kid again. And like Tom said, when a ground ball went to Brooks, when he one hop to Boog, you could see it in your mind, even though it was only on the radio.
And Jimmy, the great thing about that period of time, like you just said, every game was not televised, and we as kids followed the game, collecting baseball cards and listening to Chuck Thompson. I mean, he had some great partners that he worked with along the way, like Ernie Harwell in the 50s. He worked with Frank Messer and Bill O'Donnell for the extended period of time, Jim Carvelis. Along the way, Chuck was just magnificent in what he did, and he was old school radio too. That's the thing, creating that visual picture for everybody to understand what was going on. And also, Jimmy, I think you made a great point about back when we were kids. You know, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have YouTube, we didn't have anything like that. We sat on the front porch at night, listened to the ball games, and we weren't watching repeats of television. You know, and the 3 channels that were there before even Fox 45 started back in 1971.
Well, what we did have, we had one of the greatest teams in the 60s and 70s with most wins at Baltimore Orioles. So let's go back. They moved to Baltimore from St. Louis in 54. 64, Brooksy was MVP. We were a pretty good team. And in 1966, we got a man by the name of Frank Robinson, and we became a great team. Tell me a little bit about that 66 Orioles.
Well, the 66 Orioles were obviously far and away better than any team in baseball that year. But the interesting thing, I think it goes back to 1960 when things started to turn around. Brooks arrived full-time in 60. The Orioles sort of inched their way up to that 66 season. In 64, they finished in 3rd place, but only 2 games out of first that year. In 66, they ran off about, I guess, 5 to 7 wins early July, and they just took command of the American League. And back then there weren't divisions. You won the American League, you went to the World Series. I mean, the World Series was over first week of October, and the Orioles had a spectacular World Series where they held the Dodgers to just 2 runs in 4 games. They pitched 3 shutouts. It was the beginning of Jim Palmer's notoriety. Frank played right field, Paul Blair in center, Kurt Blefary was in left. The infield was Brooks along with Louis Aparicio. Dave Johnson, when he was known as Dave Johnson, not Davey Johnson, was the second baseman, and Boog Powell, who claims to have saved a lot of throwing errors by Brooks because of a big target there at first base. Andy Etchebarren was the catcher. And, of course, Wally Bunker pitched a shutout. Dave McNally opened the World Series up, left it to Mo Drabowski, and Mo Drabowski at one point struck out about 8 guys in a row. And overall, McNally came back to pitch the clincher at Memorial Stadium, and there's, of course, that great picture of Etchebarren, McNally, and Brooks leaping up into the air for that World Championship in 1966.
Well, one of my favorite pictures. All right, you mentioned a lot of players, and I'm so blessed to be able to work with Tom for the last 30-some years, and I've got to meet these players like Etchebarren and Brooks and Boog, and you see a side of people on these interviews while they're just Tom sitting around talking to them. He's just not the broadcaster. He's their friend. I think he's got a speed dial to Palmer in his phone. He doesn't have a speed dial because he still has a flip phone. So anyway, I'm so thankful that I've got to meet these players through you, Tom. But you find out they weren't just great on the field. They're great individuals. And I'm going to add one more guy, and that is
well, Brooks and Paul Blair, they were all great guys. I mean, all of them. Here's my flip phone, by the way, folks.
Oh, there you go. Kenny Singleton.
Kenny Singleton was a little bit later on.
My brain locked up. Kenny Singleton. Brooks is by far one of my favorite and nicest guys I ever met, but Kenny's right up there with him.
Well, the other thing, too, Jimmy, that I think stood out in that period of time was a number of players that either were traded for or came to Baltimore through the system and eventually made Baltimore their home on a regular basis. I mean, think about Brooks. He's lived in Baltimore after his days in Little Rock, Arkansas, his entire life, for one, after he came to the Orioles. I mean, Ken Singleton does the Yankees games and still lives in Baltimore 25, 26 years after he concluded his playing career. So people love Baltimore. I mean, you can go back to John Unitas living here year-round. All those people love Baltimore, and they were a part of the community, and you can't thank them enough for what they meant to this community, for the unification of something to talk about when you see somebody.
Well, you bring up Johnny U. I got to meet him through you, and you did a show with Johnny U for years, and I tell you, what a blessing it was to know him and how great he was. Tell me a little bit about Johnny U.
Well, I'll tell you, this has nothing to do with a football story as much as it has to do with the person that John Unitas was. He died exactly 1 year after 9/11, 2002. I remember when we were doing the show, and again, it was over at Fox 45 with Jimmy there, the interesting thing was he was out of town one day before the show began, and he got to the airport, the Baltimore airport, to let me know that he was on his way. Now that's just nice common courtesy, and that's the kind of person that he was. He was just a very terrific person to everybody, but to just have somebody call you and tell you that he's here and he's going to be there on time after he was out of town meant a lot to me, and that just showed you another side of John Unitas, who to me was the greatest quarterback you could ever think about in the 50s and the 60s. Obviously, some players have lasted longer and have surpassed his numbers along the way because they play so many more games. But I think if you're as old as I am, you'll never forget the 58 and 59 championship games. They were terrific for Baltimore, brought the entire community together.
Hey, Chuck announcing them games too, huh?
Yeah, unbelievable. I mean, when you think about the interconnections in sports, it really does help out the community. And it opens up conversation with people. I mean, if you get recognized, people don't want to talk about some of the abstract things. They want to talk about the team, the Orioles, what was the Colts, and now the Baltimore Ravens. I mean, it's something that unifies all of us. I mean, it really is something that is wonderful for the community sports.
I'm going to tell a funny Unitas story. Now, like I said, when Tom does these shows and interviews the players, during the breaks or before or after the show, they sit around and talk. Well, Johnny, you told us a story one time when they were doing the movie Any Given Sunday, and he met with the director, and they sat down and said, here's what's going to happen. You're going to be here, and Gene Hackman's going to be the other coach. And the last 2 minutes, you start losing the game. And Unitas said, I got up and walked out. And the guy said, whoa, what are you doing? What are you doing? He said, I'm Johnny Unitas. I don't lose the last 2 minutes. But hearing stories like that was so awesome.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing, too, he was a person that, you'd see him walking down the street, anybody stop, he would love talking with you. I mean, I can remember watching him walk down the street on Baltimore Street one time. I was in my car at the time, and somebody stopped him. He stood there and talked to him, for a couple of minutes while we were stopped at a stoplight. And, I wasn't even with him at the time. So that's the kind of person that John Unitas was.
All right, well, let's go back to baseball. So we talked about 66. Now, let's talk about the 69 team. Now, unfortunately, it didn't end well with the Miracle Mets. But all the players from Brooksy and all Boog, they all said that 69 team was one of the greatest teams of all time.
Yeah, well, not only that, the best Orioles team ever. It's kind of interesting. It wasn't that much different in 70 when they did beat the Cincinnati Reds. But when you look back at the 69 season, the thing I remember most about the World Series was the fabulous catches that the New York Mets made to rob them of key base hits. I remember Elrod Hendricks was robbed of a triple. I think Blair was robbed of probably a couple of doubles, and the same thing with Brooks. So it wasn't that they weren't trying or that the Mets were that much better, but the bounce of the ball just did not go their way when it came to hitting balls in the gaps in the outfield. I remember Ron Swoboda making a diving catch, Cleon Jones, another spectacular catch in the outfield. So, the Mets won it. The next year, the Orioles won it, and everybody thought the Reds were going to win it. So it doesn't always happen the way you think it's going to happen. But all in all, the Orioles have been to 6 World Series, and they've won 3 of them in 3 different decades. And Jim Palmer was a part of all 3 of those World Series wins. In fact, all 6 of the World Series.
Well, let's go to 70, and that's when not only Baltimore, but the world got to see how great Brooks Robinson was.
Well, and Lee May nicknamed him the human vacuum cleaner, and there wasn't a ball that got past Brooks Robinson. I think he hit over 400 in that World Series. He was the MVP of the World Series, and that really brought Brooks to national attention and eventually led him to going into the Baseball Hall of Fame. And I just want to give you one little statistic about Brooks that I sort of accidentally came up with this one. It has really nothing much to do with anything other than the number 83. Brooks was 83 this past year in 2020. He was born in 1937. Also, he went into Baseball's Hall of Fame in 1983, and the Orioles won their last World Series in 1983. So
wow.
You got 83, 83, 83 there. It just subsided as we entered into 2021.
How about that? Well, let's go to 71. They also had a great team, and I think they did something that will never repeat in sports, and that's that they had 4 20-game winners.
Exactly right, and you'll never see that happen again because pitchers don't go deep enough into games to win 20 games
You get
anymore.
one 20-game winner, it's a big deal.
Yeah, Palmer, McNally, Cuellar, and Pat Dobson, they were it. They're all photographed in those orange uniforms that lasted a day or two. They were actually manufactured here locally when the teams had more control of the uniforms. But when you look back at that team, it was an excellent team also. But, again, the Pittsburgh Pirates went to 7, and they wound up beating the Orioles in the 7th deciding game.
All right, so then we kind of change in the 70s. We go from the first set of greatness to the second set when Eddie came and Kenny came and Dempsey, your friend Rick, and then later Ripken. So let's talk about the 70s and early 80s, though, Orioles.
Well, I think the transition came there, Jimmy, with the fact that, they basically had Dennis Martinez and Scott McGregor and Mike Flanagan to replace some of those pitchers that the Orioles had in the early 70s. There were some great trades made by Hank Peters, the then general manager, to bring in Scott McGregor. He also brought in Rick Dempsey in the deal on Tippy Martinez, and they sort of solidified the team for a 10-year period of time. The Orioles, kind of interestingly enough, went down to the last day of the season in 1982 and lost to the Milwaukee Brewers and didn't make it to postseason play. But in 83, they won it all. So, again, they're sort of what you call building blocks to get to where they got to with the championship. So they won in 66, 70, and also 1983. That was the last time the Orioles won a World Series. But, they were able to reload a couple of times, and that what kept them what I would call, a winning organization. As Jimmy mentioned earlier, from about 1960 to 1985, the Orioles were the winningest team in all of baseball.
Right. Well, Tom, I appreciate being my guest today. And again, I thank you for the last 30-some years and giving me the opportunity to meet all these great players we talked about. And, we're both getting up there near retirement, so hopefully we'll keep doing this.
I'm never going to retire, Jimmy. As long as you can keep shooting my shows, I'll be there.
I'm going to buy you a real phone, too.
No. I've been offered. I love the flip phone. I don't text, email, tweet, Facebook, any of that stuff. I like to be very private. I don't want to ever say something that's going to get me fired. And I got 50 years in June the 1st, and I'm very proud of that. And I want to do another 50 beyond that, God willing.
There you go. Well, my special guest has been Mr. Tom Davis. And, Tom, thanks again.
Anytime, Jimmy. Love talking with you.